When two imposters from a fake homeowners association showed up at Matthew Collins's doorstep, demanding to confiscate his firearms, the retired U.S. Marshal knew something was terribly wrong. These men, armed with nothing but forged papers and a misplaced sense of power, thought they could bully him into submission. But Matthew wasn't the kind of man who backed down, not when his land and his rights were on the line. But just wait until you hear how this tense standoff turned in his favor, and how justice finally prevailed in the end. It was a still afternoon in Pine Ridge, the kind that stretched long and quiet, as if the world itself had hit pause. Matthew Collins had just returned home from a solitary hunt, the cool weight of his rifles grounding him as always. His old hands gripped the worn stalks, the grain of the wood familiar beneath his fingers. Every time he held them, he remembered the years spent as a U.S. Marshal, how the cold steel of his duty had balanced the warmth of his family, the cost of both heavy in their own right. His house sat on the outskirts of town, tucked away in a place where the sprawling fields and thick woods felt like an extension of the land itself. It was peaceful, too peaceful. The kind of place where you could let your guard down, even if just for a moment, but the moment wasn't to last. As Matthew made his way up the driveway, his boots crunching softly over the gravel, he spotted two figures approaching from the far end. They were dressed in plain clothes, but something about their posture and the way they moved caught his eye. It wasn't the confident stride of someone with purpose. No, it was more like they were playing a part, pretending to be something they were not. A sense of unease prickled at the back of his neck, and as they drew closer, his suspicion deepened. One of the men, taller with a stubble-lined jaw, had a badge hanging loosely from his neck, the metal catching the afternoon light in a way that felt wrong. The other man, slightly shorter and stockier, had the same badge, but his expression seemed far too casual for someone wearing a symbol of authority. "Mr. Collins," the taller man called out, his voice smooth but lacking the edge of true authority. "We're from the Homeowners Association. We're here to confiscate your firearms." The words hung in the air, and for a heartbeat time seemed to stand still. Matthew froze, his hand still wrapped around the grip of his rifle. His mind raced. This had to be a mistake, a joke. The HOA didn't have the power to take his property. There were rules, boundaries. He knew them, lived by them for years, and they weren't about to be trampled by two men who didn't even belong here. His gaze hardened, and instinct kicked in. He was still that Marshal, no matter how many years had passed, no matter how quiet his life had become since the badge was retired. His breath steadied, and with one firm motion he placed his rifle gently down on the porch, his eyes never leaving theirs. "You can't just take my rifles," Matthew said, his voice calm but heavy, like the weight of years spent upholding justice. "Who do you think you are?" He wasn't shouting. He didn't need to. The force of his words alone was enough to cut through the thick tension between them. The men didn't move, but they didn't back down either. Instead, the taller one took a step forward, holding out a sheet of paper. Matthew's eyes darted to it. What he saw made his blood run cold. A warrant. But something about it felt off. Too hastily written, too vague. It didn't carry the weight of an official document. I don't care what that paper says. Matthew's voice dropped lower, more dangerous now, like the growl of an animal cornered in its den. You have no right to be here. No right to take what's mine. The taller man hesitated. For just a split second, Matthew saw the flicker of doubt in his eyes, a brief crack in the facade they had built. But it was quickly masked by arrogance. This is official business, Mr. Collins. Step aside. Matthew's fingers curled into fists, the familiarity of his old self sharpening his focus. He wasn't about to let these men violate the sanctity of his home without answers. He had spent too many years in the field, serving the law, to let this kind of injustice go unchecked. You've got 5 seconds to get off my property, Matthew said, his tone steady as steel, his eyes fixed on the taller man. His hand hovered near the rifle again, the wood smooth beneath his fingertips. Or I'll make sure the only place you'll be going is the back of a patrol car. And just like that, the quiet of Pine Ridge, the calm he had fought for all these years, was shattered. The tension escalated quickly, the calm of Pine Ridge shattered by the sharp edge of confrontation. Matthew's instincts kicked into overdrive as the two men grew more agitated, their eyes narrowing, their hands twitching with impatience. One of them, the shorter man, grabbed for the rifle case without so much as a word of warning. He yanked it off the porch, his grip tight and reckless. Matthew's pulse quickened, but he didn't budge. The case was his property. And no one, not even these self-proclaimed officials, had the right to take it. The taller man, sensing the tension, drew a taser from his belt, aiming it directly at Matthew's chest. The buzzing of the weapon's readiness seemed to cut through the air, a harsh reminder of how quickly things could go south. Don't resist, the taller man sneered, a false confidence in his voice. It's either this or we call the police. Matthew's gaze locked on the taser, his mind working in overdrive. He knew he was outnumbered, but he wasn't about to let fear dictate his actions. His grip tightened, the familiar weight of years spent protecting the law flooding back to him. These men weren't just trespassing. They were committing an illegal act. This wasn't a dispute over property lines or noise complaints. This was an outright violation. They thought they could intimidate him with threats, with weapons, with the mere mention of police. But they had no idea who they were dealing with. His breath steadied, and in that moment Matthew felt the years fall away. His training, the things he had once lived and breathed as a U.S. Marshal, kicked in with precision. Authority wasn't just a badge. It was a mindset, a way of standing firm, of knowing the law and not backing down. That's not how this works, Matthew muttered, his voice low and threatening, but steady as a rock. You've got no right to seize anything from me. The men laughed, their cocky smiles stretching wide. They thought they were in control. They thought he was just some old man, someone they could push around. But the confidence behind their laughter faltered when Matthew slammed his hand down on the rifle case, pinning it to the porch floor with a force that made the men stumble back. The taller man's eyes widened, and Matthew didn't give him a chance to recover. With lightning speed, he reached into his jacket pocket, his fingers brushing against the cool metal of his phone. Without taking his eyes off them, he dialed the one number he hadn't used in years, the Marshal's office. The weight of that call settled over him like a familiar cloak, a reminder of his past and the power that came with it. The men froze for a moment. The phone rang once, twice, and then a voice crackled over the line. Matthew's voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the authority in his words. "This is Matthew Collins," he said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "I need backup at my residence. I'm being harassed by two men pretending to be law enforcement. I need immediate assistance." The line went silent for a beat, and Matthew felt the men's unease ripple through the air. They had expected him to fold under pressure, but instead he was doing something they hadn't anticipated. He was taking control of the situation. The shorter man cursed under his breath, his hand tightening on the taser, but he didn't move closer. The taller man's jaw clenched, his eyes darting between Matthew and the phone. They had underestimated him. They thought they were dealing with an old retiree, someone past his prime. But Matthew wasn't about to let them walk all over him, not without a fight. The phone line clicked, and a voice came through, clear and sharp. "We've got a team en route. Sit tight, Mr. Collins. Help is on the way." Matthew didn't reply. He didn't need to. He was already moving, shifting his stance to block the men from the door. His eyes never left theirs, his gaze unflinching. He wasn't about to let these men take another step without facing the consequences of their actions. They had underestimated him, but it was a mistake they would soon regret. The tension snapped like a taut wire, and the confrontation reached its breaking point in an instant. One of the men, desperate and frantic, lunged at Matthew with the taser, his eyes wild with the intention to subdue him. But Matthew's reflexes, sharp, ingrained from years of service, took over without a second thought. In a single, fluid motion, he caught the man's wrist before the taser could even fire. The man grunted, caught off guard, as Matthew twisted his arm behind his back with practiced precision. The move was swift and efficient, a show of control that left the man pinned to the ground before he could even register what had happened. The other man, realizing the situation had just gone from bad to worse, bolted for his truck, his boots kicking up dust in his haste. But Matthew wasn't fazed. His phone was already in his hand, fingers flying over the keys with urgency. He wasn't about to let these two criminals get away, and with his old colleagues on the way, he knew this would be over soon. The sound of his old comrades' voices crackled through the phone, and Matthew spoke, his tone low, clipped, and laced with anger. "Tell your boss that U.S. Marshal Matthew Collins is still alive," he said, his voice steady but carrying the weight of his authority. "And you'll be leaving my property with nothing but your pride." There was a brief, tense silence on the other end. The man who had tried to run paused, his foot hovering over the gas pedal, but he could feel it, the cold realization that they were no longer in control. The man pinned beneath Matthew on the porch squirmed, his bravado evaporating as the reality set in. They weren't dealing with some helpless old man. They were facing someone who had the power to end this with a single phone call. Matthew didn't flinch. His eyes remained locked on the man in the truck, who now hesitated, glancing back toward his partner on the ground. The sirens, faint at first, began to grow louder, a steady reminder that the cavalry was on the way. The men's confidence shattered like glass. The cocky attitude that had driven them to trespass, to threaten him, vanished in an instant. They were no longer acting with the power of authority. They were acting out of fear. With a shared glance, the two men scrambled. The man in the truck threw it in reverse, tires screeching on the gravel, while his partner managed to wriggle free from Matthew's grip. He wasted no time, sprinting toward the truck in a frantic attempt to escape. In their haste, they left behind their false authority, their fabricated badges, and their arrogance. As Matthew stood on his porch, the sound of the truck peeling away into the distance, he took a deep breath. The weight of his rifle case in his hand felt comforting, familiar. The sirens were closer now, the sound of law enforcement drawing near. He didn't move, not yet. The adrenaline still thrummed through him, but a sense of calm had returned. He had stood his ground. He had reminded them and himself that some things never change. Matthew Collins wasn't just a relic of the past. He was a force to be reckoned with. And as the flashing lights of the approaching squad cars painted the dirt driveway in streaks of red and blue, he finally allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. They had underestimated him, but they wouldn't make that mistake again. In the end, the only thing the two men had taken was their pride, and that was something Matthew had no intention of returning. By the time the local sheriff arrived, the two men had vanished, their false badges and fake paperwork nothing more than scrap paper now. The calmness of the afternoon had returned, but the stillness felt like the aftermath of a storm lingering in the air. Matthew stood on his porch, his back straight, the weight of the moment settling in. When the sheriff stepped out of his cruiser, he took in the scene. Matthew standing tall, the open rifle case on the ground, and the dust still hanging in the air. The sheriff was a large man, built like a truck, his face a mixture of confusion and concern as he approached. "Collins," the sheriff greeted, his voice thick with disbelief. What in the world happened here? Matthew didn't waste time with pleasantries. He pulled out his old credentials, worn but still unmistakably real, and handed them to the sheriff. It was a subtle but unspoken reminder that, while he might have hung up his badge years ago, the power and authority behind it were still very much intact. The sheriff raised an eyebrow as he studied the credentials. "You're telling me these two," he pointed to the area where the men had fled, "were impersonating officers?" Matthew nodded, his face hard as granite. "They tried to seize my property, and they didn't have any legal right to do so." The sheriff cursed under his breath. "That's some serious business. I'll get my guys on it right away." He took a moment to survey the porch, the quietness of the scene now almost surreal. Then his expression softened as he turned back to Matthew. "I'll be pressing charges for impersonating law enforcement, obstruction, the whole list." Matthew's heart, which had been pounding since the moment those men showed up at his door, finally began to slow. It had been a long time since he had felt the weight of real justice, but in this quiet moment it was clear. The system had worked. And though it had taken more than just law on paper to make it happen, it was justice nonetheless. Matthew let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The adrenaline that had kept him alert now drained from his body, leaving him exhausted but satisfied. The rifles were still there, untouched. The intruders were gone. His land was his again. Slowly, Matthew walked back into his home. The old, familiar creak of the floorboards beneath his boots was a welcome sound. He placed the rifle case on the table by the door and sat in his chair, the weight of the day lifting off his shoulders. His fingers brushed across the drawer where his old badge lay, still tucked away out of sight. It hadn't seen the light of day in years, but its presence still mattered. Matthew didn't need to wear it to command respect. It wasn't just metal. It was a symbol, a reminder of the years he had spent protecting the law. Today, that badge had made all the difference. As the sheriff's vehicle rumbled off into the distance, Matthew closed his eyes for a moment, savoring the feeling of victory, however quiet it was. Justice had been done. The men who had tried to steal from him, to assert false power over him, had learned the hard way that some things, like the strength of the law, couldn't be bought or intimidated out of existence. In the end, it wasn't just about the rifles. It was about standing firm in the face of injustice and knowing that sometimes doing the right thing, however hard, was worth it.